There is a document in the National Archives, 12 pages long, signed October 3rd, 1913. Most Americans have never read it. Most Americans live inside it every single day. I found it because I was researching something else entirely. I was tracing how the federal government funded itself before the modern era: tariffs, excise taxes, land sales, a different financial architecture, a system that ran the United States for 124 years without ever touching a worker's paycheck. And then I hit 1913, and everything changed. Here's the fact that stopped me cold. The men who wrote the 16th Amendment and the amendment that created the federal income tax said publicly on the floor of the United States Senate that this tax would never touch the average American. One senator called it a tax on the idle rich. The rate was 1%. The threshold was $3,000, which in 1913 meant roughly the top 3% of earners. Everyone else was explicitly, deliberately excluded. That promise lasted exactly 5 years. What happened between 1913 and 1918 is the sequence no civics class ever walks you through. And once you see it, once you line up the dates, the names, and the legislation, you cannot look at your pay stub the same way again. There is a document in the National Archives, 12 pages long, signed October 3rd, 1913. It is called the Revenue Act of 1913. Its official nickname is the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act. Most people, when they hear that name, assume it has something to do with trade. They move on. That is exactly what the name was designed to make you do. I came to this document sideways. I was researching how the American federal government financed itself before the modern era, specifically the tariff system that funded everything from the Civil War recovery to the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad without ever dipping into a working man's wages. What I found was a functioning financial architecture that lasted from 1789 to 1913, 124 years. Then, inside a single calendar year, it was replaced, root and branch, simultaneously. Not one replacement, two. The 16th Amendment, the income tax, that was ratified February 3rd, 1913. The Federal Reserve Act was signed December 23rd, 1913, 10 months apart, same year, same Congress, same president. I kept returning to that date, 1913. It sits in the timeline like a locked door. Let me walk you through what the official record says, step by step, because each piece taken alone sounds completely reasonable. Step 1. The Supreme Court in 1895 ruled in Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust that a federal income tax was unconstitutional. The court said direct taxes must be apportioned among states by population. An income tax by nature cannot be apportioned that way, so it was struck down. The government accepted the ruling and moved on. Reasonable. Courts rule, Congress obeys, except that ruling stood for 18 years, and during those 18 years, a very specific group of people worked methodically to reverse it, not through Congress, through the Constitution itself. Step 2. In 1910, Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee and father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller, Jr., convened a secret meeting on Jekyll Island, Georgia. The attendees included representatives of J.P. Morgan, Kuhn, Loeb and Company, Rockefeller banking interests, and the U.S. Treasury. They traveled in a private railroad car. They used first names only. The meeting lasted 9 days. The official explanation: they were designing a central banking proposal. Reasonable. Bankers meet. Policy gets discussed, except the proposal they produced, the Aldrich Plan, became, with modifications, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. And the man who chaired that Jekyll Island meeting, Nelson Aldrich, had spent the previous 3 years publicly advocating for a constitutional amendment to allow a federal income tax. One man, two systems, designed in sequence, enacted in the same year. But this was only the first layer of the pattern. Step 3, the 16th Amendment required ratification by 3/4 of the states, 36 states at the time. The official count says it was ratified by 42 states. A researcher named Bill Benson spent 3 years in the 1980s physically traveling to state archives and collecting the original ratification documents. His finding, compiled in a work called The Law That Never Was, was that many state legislatures had ratified a version of the amendment that differed from the version passed by Congress. Different wording, different punctuation, different capitalization. Under standard constitutional law, a state must ratify the exact text passed by Congress, not a modified version. The official response to Benson's research was not a detailed rebuttal of his document analysis. It was a series of court rulings that declared the question non-justiciable, meaning courts refused to examine it on procedural grounds. Reasonable. Courts manage their dockets. Procedural rulings happen constantly, except non-justiciable means the underlying claim was never examined on its merits, not disproven, not examined. Step 4. Now look at what the amendment's supporters promised during the ratification debates. Senator Joseph Bailey of Texas, one of the amendment's most vocal champions, said explicitly that the tax would affect at most the wealthiest 400,000 Americans. He said working people would never see it. The threshold of $3,000, $4,000 for married couples, was not an accident. In 1913, the median annual wage for an American worker was approximately $600. The income tax threshold was 5 times the median wage. By design, it was a tax on a different world than the one most Americans inhabited. That promise was made in 1913. What happened next is the part no textbook lingers on. Step 5. The War Revenue Act of 1917 raised the top income tax rate from 7% to 67%. The Revenue Act of 1918 pushed it to 77%. The threshold, the floor below which no American owed taxes, began descending quietly. Bill by bill, amendment to amendment, not through a new constitutional process, through ordinary legislation passed in the urgency of wartime, extended in the aftermath of war when the urgency had passed, but the mechanism remained. By 1944, the top marginal rate reached 94%, and the threshold had dropped so low that ordinary factory workers, people earning wages that would have been invisible to the original 1913 framework, were now fully inside the system. But the tax rate is not the most significant change that happened in those years. The most significant change happened in 1943, and almost no one knows its name. It is called the Current Tax Payment Act, and it was designed by a man named Beardsley Ruml. Beardsley Ruml was the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He was also simultaneously the treasurer of R.H. Macy and Company, the department store. In 1942, he submitted a proposal to the American Institute of Accountants that would solve a government collection problem. Americans were struggling to pay their annual tax bills in lump sums. Tax compliance was declining. Revenue was uncertain. Ruml's solution was called withholding at source. The employer deducts the tax before the paycheck is issued. The worker never sees the money. The worker never makes a decision about the money. The transaction happens upstream of consciousness. Congress passed it in 1943. President Roosevelt signed it. One of the key technical architects who helped design the withholding system was a young economist working for the Treasury Department at the time. His name was Milton Friedman, who would later become the most influential free market economist of the 20th century. He acknowledged his role in designing withholding decades later and said he regretted it. Now consider the sequence. 1913, constitutional amendment establishes the legal framework. Affects 3% of earners. 1917 through 1918. Wartime legislation expands rates and begins lowering thresholds. 1943. Withholding system is implemented. The money is separated from the worker before the worker can hold it. 1944. Threshold continues to fall. 52 million Americans file income tax returns, up from fewer than 8 million just 4 years earlier. That is not organic growth. That is a systematic expansion across 29 years, using each crisis as a lever until the architecture that was explicitly promised to touch only the very wealthy had enclosed virtually every working American. And here is what I keep returning to. The withholding system was described in 1943 as a wartime temporary measure. That phrase, temporary measure, had been used before. In 1913, the income tax itself was described by multiple senators as a temporary mechanism to address budget shortfalls. Both the tax and the withholding mechanism arrived as temporary. Both became permanent. Neither was ever removed. Maybe I'm seeing a pattern where none exists. Maybe each expansion was genuinely driven by separate circumstances. A war here, a depression there, an administrative efficiency needs somewhere else. Each decision examined individually has a reasonable explanation. But then I look at the timeline. And I look at who was in the room at each decision point, and I notice that the men who designed these systems, Aldrich, Ruml, the Jekyll Island group, moved between banking, government, and central finance in ways that made the boundaries between those institutions difficult to locate, and I find it harder to call the sequence coincidental. Let me tell you what the system actually cost, not in percentages, but in lives. In 1913, an American worker received every dollar he earned. He might pay local property taxes, he might pay tariffs embedded in the prices of imported goods, but his wage, the physical envelope of money handed to him on Friday, was his completely before any federal obligation. That worker made decisions with that money. He felt its weight. He chose when to spend it, when to save it, when to invest it in a plot of land or a small business or his children's schooling. The friction of payment, the act of writing a check to the government once a year, made the cost of government visible, tangible, debatable. By 1945, that worker's grandson never saw his full wage. It was extracted before it arrived. The government's portion was invisible, not because it didn't exist, but because the architecture of the system was designed to make it disappear before consciousness. Beardsley Ruml understood this. In his original 1942 proposal, he wrote that withholding would make tax collection more efficient precisely because the taxpayer would not experience the payment as a loss. The money would simply never appear. What you never have, you do not grieve. Think about what that means across 3 generations of American families. A family in rural Tennessee in 1925. The father earns wages at a textile mill. He receives his full pay. He sits at the kitchen table with his wife and they discuss what they owe, what they can keep, what the government's claim costs them in concrete terms. That conversation happens because the payment is visible. It requires a decision. It has weight. His son working a factory job in 1950, he receives a pay stub that lists in a separate column the federal withholding already removed. He did not make a payment. He received a reduced payment. The framing is different. The psychological experience is different. He is not paying the government. He is receiving what is left after the government has already taken. His grandson filing taxes in 2005, if his withholding exceeded his actual liability, he receives a refund. And here's the most remarkable transformation in the entire sequence. Millions of Americans came to experience that refund, the return of their own previously held money, as a windfall, as a gift, as something to celebrate. And the architecture did not just extract money, it rewired the relationship between the citizen and the state's financial claim on his labor. And somewhere in that rewiring, the original promise, made in the United States Senate in 1913 by men who swore the system would never touch ordinary Americans, became not just broken but forgotten, not erased by force, erased by accumulated familiarity, by the fact that no living American can remember a time before it. Consider this. If you are 65 years old today, the withholding system is older than you are. You have never lived outside it. Your parents may have been born into it. The idea that your full wage was once yours, that the federal government's claim was once visible, contested, and politically negotiated at the kitchen table rather than silently extracted before sunrise, that idea feels historical in the way that horse-drawn carriages feel historical. It happened, but it does not feel real. That distance between what happened and what feels real, that is where the most significant erasure lives. And yet, traces remain, because systems this large leave marks that outlast the official explanations. The language preserves what the legislation tried to normalize. We still say, take-home pay, a phrase that only makes sense if there's a distinction between what you earn and what you take home. The phrase encodes the memory of a gap, a subtraction, something that was yours and then was not. We still say tax refund bris, which is technically a misnomer. A refund implies you overpaid a merchant and are receiving your excess payment back. But a tax refund is the government returning money it overwithheld from your paycheck. Money it held, interest-free, for up to 12 months. The word refund softens that. It makes an involuntary loan sound like a correction of a clerical error. The original congressional debate transcripts from 1913 are publicly available in the congressional record. They are not hidden. They are not redacted. You can read verbatim the promises made on the Senate floor by the amendment's sponsors. Senator John Sharp Williams of Mississippi said, on the record, that the income tax was designed to fall on those with income so large that ordinary Americans would never encounter it. Senator Williams was not a fringe figure. He was a senior Democrat, a former House Minority Leader. Those transcripts are in the Library of Congress. They have always been there. The absence is not in the documents. The absence is in the curriculum. The Jekyll Island meeting itself was secret for 20 years. The participants denied it happened. Then, in 1930, one of the attendees, Frank Vanderlip, former president of the National City Bank of New York, published a memoir in the Saturday Evening Post in which he confirmed the meeting, confirmed the participants, and described the secrecy in detail. He said they had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal their identities because if it became known that a group of New York bankers had designed the Federal Reserve, Congress would never have passed it. That admission is also publicly available. It is quoted in academic histories of the Federal Reserve. It is not a fringe claim. It is a primary source document written by a participant published in one of the most widely read magazines in American history. In Beardsley Ruml's original proposal of the 1942 document in which he explicitly described the psychological advantage of withholding was published in Taxes magazine. It is archived. It can be read. The mechanism was not hidden. It was published in a trade journal under the assumption that ordinary Americans did not read trade journals, which in 1942 they largely did not. What persists is not a secret. It is a public record that was never taught, never summarized, never placed in sequence in a way that showed what it added up to. The documents preserve what the textbooks chose not to carry forward. So here's where I land. Not at a conclusion. I want to be precise about that. I am not telling you the system was designed with malicious intent. I am not telling you the men in that Jekyll Island house in 1910 were planning a century of extraction. I cannot know what they intended. I can only see what they built. What they built in 10 months in 1913 and then expanded across 30 years of legislation is a system in which the federal government's financial claim on American labor became invisible, automatic, and structurally prior to the worker's own access to his earnings. The promise made in 1913 was explicit. It was made on the Senate floor by named senators whose words are preserved in the congressional record. The promise was, "This will not touch you. This is for the very wealthy. This is temporary." Every word of that promise was reversed, not violently, not suddenly. Incrementally, across decades, through legislation that was always reasonable, in isolation, always justified by emergency, always described as temporary. And here is the question I cannot stop turning over. If the promise had been kept, which if the income tax had remained at 1% on incomes above $3,000, affecting 3% of earners as advertised, what would the federal government have been forced to do differently? What programs could not have been funded? What wars could not have been financed? What expansions of federal power required as their precondition access to the wages of every working American? The tax did not just fund the government, the access, the legal, constitutional withholding and forced access to every American paycheck created a financial foundation that made possible scales of federal action that would have been literally impossible to fund any other way. The question is not whether that access was obtained by deception. The question is what was built on top of it. And somewhere in those 1913 Senate transcripts, in the gap between what was promised and what was enacted, that question is still waiting for an answer. The congressional record does not forget, not even when the curriculum agrees to.